Welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I have been looking forward to this for quite some time, as Joe and I have been trying to coordinate our schedules to make this work. So Joe, welcome to today's webinar presentation.
Thank you, Bill.
I just want to tell a little story about Joe before we start. I know most of you on the call probably know Joe, but some years ago, Joe showed up at, I don't remember what it was, Joe, maybe a DASA or SAPA conference, long before NDASA existed. And she was speaking, and she was telling us a little bit about her background, and that she loved what she was seeing here in the room with all of these drug testing providers, and that she planned to be engaged and involved in the industry. And I sat there thinking, how many times have I heard that from people who come to our conferences? But Joe turned out to be the real thing, and she has not only been engaged with the industry, but was really one of the key driving forces that helped to create NDASA, which is one of the two associations in our industry that most of us are members of, and has really done a great job in helping the industry and supporting the industry. But the reason why we're doing this webinar together is that what I've learned over the years is that Joe is really an expert on the marijuana issue, how it affects the workplace, certainly, and we're going to talk about that today, but just a broad range of subtopics when it comes to marijuana. And some time ago, a couple of years ago or so, she was invited to write a chapter for a book that was being published on marijuana, and she shared that chapter with me, and I was blown away. I loved it. And for whatever reason, her chapter didn't end up getting published in this book. And so I said, well, Joe, I would love to do something with that chapter. And so we have lots of plans to use the components of that chapter to promote the issues that she's talking about. But we also used it as an outline for today's webinar podcast style presentation. So we're going to kind of follow that sort of outline that she used in her chapter of the book, which I thought was not only well written, but really informative. And so for that reason and many others, excited to have Joe on the call, one of my truly favorite people in the drug testing industry. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to put the first question up on the screen. We're going to just start with a very basic question. And so let me pause so that you can see the picture very clearly. And so, Joe, what is the deal with marijuana now? Is usage increasing, and what are sort of the driving forces that are contributing to that?
Well, I really appreciate this question, Bill. And the reason I think it's important is because I always tell people, be careful if you look for information and believe what Google says, because there's a lot of information flooding the internet that indicates since we've changed state laws, use has actually decreased. And the information is based on very, very flawed perspectives. Because if you go to, for instance, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, if you look at some other surveys that are done that gauge these things on a statewide basis, if we look at even to our own industry, if we look at the Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index, we see clear spikes in marijuana use amongst students, amongst adults, amongst senior citizens, amongst risk groups, amongst minority groups. We just see it across the board. And in our adult population, we're particularly concerned about the increased use in the workforce age bracket. So ages particularly 35 to 52, extreme spikes in use, and that's our working people. So, even at the college level, we're seeing spikes. Where the misinformation has come from is there was one survey in the state of Colorado called Healthy Kids Colorado Survey. It's done on the odd school years. So I think we do it on 7th grade, 9th grade, and 11th grade. We might have decreased it now to 5th grade. And we ask schools to participate. We ask students to take this survey anonymously. And we did have some people coming out and saying, oh, look, there was a drop in youth marijuana use after legalization. Therefore, youth use has gone down. Therefore, it actually decreases youth use, and then use altogether. And if you want to decrease drug use, you legalize marijuana. This was also purported to be a key factor in decreasing opioids use, but it was a huge misperception because the survey is voluntary. It was not allowed to be taken by several of our schools in urban areas, so it was rural based. And in Colorado, you have like real urban cities on the I-25 corridor, and then the rest of the state is farm country, basically. So it was out in our rural communities. Again, not every student had to take the survey. And then the data was put on a scale that was like 3 times the size measurement as a normal measuring scale, which doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. But when you're doing statistics, what you can do is you can make numbers look much smaller. And so we have since discovered in other surveys, like National Survey of Drug Use and Health, and by other data markers that we use, such as mental health treatment, such as drug rehab treatment, that information was absolutely 100% inaccurate. So we are seeing increases, and the reason that we're seeing increases, Bill, is straight up, a lot of people will say causation doesn't equal correlation and whatnot. We hear that a lot in the Quest DTI, that we're looking at correlations, but we can't necessarily say causation. But for me, my opinion, Joe McGuire, living in the epicenter of legal marijuana in Colorado, I will say to you, it's because we're changing our state laws. And the reason I feel so strongly about this is before I came into the world of drug testing, I actually worked in school prevention programs. I was part of a statewide initiative in Colorado called Safe to Tell. And that was our state's response to the Columbine massacre. And it was an initiative under the Attorney General's office. And we spent years talking to students, parents, school administrators, teachers, and law enforcement officers about what causes increase in risk behaviors. And according to every professional organization out there that works in prevention or education, we know that when perceptions of risk go down, use goes up. It's incontrovertible data that we've known for 30 years in our country since prevention really took hold. So when perception of harm goes down and people think, oh, this is safe, this can't hurt me, then use skyrockets. But if they think something can hurt them or is harmful to them, use drops. And so we've seen these correlations with cigarette smoking. When people really saw what the tobacco industry did to dupe them into thinking their products were safe, and then saw the harms associated, and we got Surgeon General warnings and black box warnings for pregnancy and that type of thing, we saw the market decrease to the point where the tobacco industry panicked and started using other tactics to get customers, right? So we know this is how this works, and we've seen it in a variety of areas. So I, Joe McGuire, will boldly say that when we change our laws and make this socially acceptable, we see use increase because people who normally would have never used before use and try in greater numbers.
So you've kind of taken over my second question, but specifically, Joe, because in actually the third question coming up, you sort of referred to, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and combine 2 and 3 into the same question. So in the chapter for the book that you wrote, you talk about a false narrative that's being promoted by the media. And so one of my questions is, what is that false narrative, and why would the media be invested in promoting a false narrative? Where's the false narrative coming from? And then how, specifically to this question, how is it affecting the legalization of marijuana and perhaps other drugs as well?
So this is a big question, Bill. And so I'm sorry for stepping over the question, but so this has really become a cultural shift that we've seen. It's a paradigm shift in our nation. So to kind of go back and give a little bit of history, which I think is really important in understanding this issue, the perpetuators of legal cannabis on the whole is the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws. And it's called NORML is their acronym. And NORML's goal is to normalize marijuana use. And it has been for decades. They were nearly successful in completing national legalization of marijuana in the late 70s. This was an all-out campaign that they engaged in. They are an organized group. I would say back in the 60s, it started out as more of a sort of a brotherhood of people who just love smoking pot kind of a thing, maybe from the hippie movement or whatnot. And it really was very much kind of around that hippie culture. And then it started, you know, some of those people started maturing a bit and said, we need to treat this more like a business and get serious about this and accomplish what we want to accomplish. A lot of this was based in California, the Golden Triangle, where there's kind of been for many, many decades sort of a blatant disregard of the law, and that's where a lot of the sourcing of the country's marijuana crop came from. So they actually organized and they strategized and they got together, and they had made some key connections with U.S. senators and congressmen, and had formulated a plan to legalize marijuana. You know, and at that time in that day, we really were talking about some low-grade potency weed as was common in that day, not what we have today. But they had to overcome some obstacles. And so there is video, there's actually video that was taken of some of their meetings that got into the hands of the prevention movement. And in some of these meetings, they talk about what their key strategies would be. And one of the core key strategies was they had to make drug testing look ineffective and completely delegitimize drug testing, because that's one of their greatest threats. One of the other key goals, it actually was the primary goal that came out of their meetings, and I have had some of this footage in the past, but I lost it on a drive that got corrupted, and it just broke my heart because it's very hard to find on the internet now because it's been scrubbed. But I have colleagues that have this playing on their websites. One of their key goals was to create a misperception that marijuana is medicine and is needed as medicine, so that people would get used to the idea that, oh, if I need it, and they specifically say, if I need it for my glaucoma, and everybody in the room laughs hysterically. They're like, no, but seriously, if I need it for my glaucoma, you can't keep it away from me because I have to have my medicine. And it started out as a joke with them, and then they realized it was going to catch on. So on the flip side, going back to drug testing, it really was, how do we delegitimize drug testing? And so over the years, they played with different things, but what they first started doing was writing articles about the harms of drug testing and how it hurts people, how it's discriminatory. Well, now that's a major banner of theirs, is that it's discriminatory. We actually have studies showing the opposite. We have studies that show that drug testing, that minority people do better when they are when they are subjected to, for lack of a better term, pre-employment drug testing, that minorities get, more of them get jobs, pass drug tests, and succeed in the workplace when there's a drug testing program than not. So the idea that drug testing is discriminatory specifically to minorities, and we've seen major companies come out and state that this is a known fact, like Amazon. They've put it out in their publicity and said, since it's a known fact that a workplace drug testing is discriminatory, we will no longer do, you know, this amount of drug testing for THC. That's actually a discriminatory statement, because you're making an assumption that people that are minorities will be discriminated against across the board if you drug test, when the opposite is true, right? But what happened is, so they started flooding the market with what, you know, we can shortcut and call fake news, but it's deeper than that. What they did is they paid researchers to do paid studies to come to a particular conclusion based on formulations that they constructed. And so they started flooding the market with these studies. And actually, and Bill, I know you're probably very familiar with this. In the early 2000s, they were allowed to present their material at a National Education Association conference and convinced the NEA to stop drug testing in schools because of this false data and these false studies that were just based on their political views and wants and needs. So because of that, for decades, the media was flooded with bad information, such as I can smoke a joint on the 1st of May, and on the 30th of May, if I get drug tested, I'm going to fail my drug test. That's not fair. And that was repeated so much in their circles, in their publications, in High Times Magazine, that it is filtered out on college campuses. It's filtered out into the world where every media outlet believes this is true. People in our own industry believe this is true. We've heard this from our own colleagues of, well, how do we answer this question? Because clearly what we're doing is unfair. When that one fact is a physiological, scientific impossibility. So now we have this wave of information. I mean, we've even heard it from the White House. In 3 administrations, for sure, we've heard this issue. Well, how do you fight the issue that it stays in your system for 30 days, right? And it's just a misunderstanding or a misperception. Really, it's a very intentional misguiding of the truth, and we're trying to fight back on that here these decades later, and we're so far behind the curve. So it's been very intentional. And why, to your question of why the media supports this, is because they truly and sincerely believe this information that's been out there, that what we do is discriminatory and that it's flawed and that it's unreliable and harmful to people, and everybody will lose their jobs if you test for marijuana, which is absolutely not true. And we're fighting a cultural paradigm based on false information. And I've often said it's not a David and Goliath situation. It's a Goliath versus little teeny tiny ants on the bottom of someone's shoe. And it's a big job that we have to do to correct this.
So let me, let me advance ahead to this question, because a lot of states have legalized marijuana, either for medicinal use or recreational use. Other states have decriminalized small amounts for personal possession. But the question that I want to ask is, and I asked this question in light of developments first in Oregon, but we're seeing other states considering legislation that would essentially decriminalize all illicit drugs. And there were reports recently that Oregon, which did this for heroin and cocaine, et cetera, now they're having buyer's remorse in Oregon because they've seen such a dramatic increase in drug abuse in the state. And so my question is, as we go forward with so many states having legalized marijuana, do you ever foresee a time when some of these states will either repeal or significantly cut back on their legal marijuana laws?
Bill, I'm an eternal optimist. Sometimes to the point where I really annoy people around me. And so some of my colleagues, I'm on a couple of speakers bureaus in the US, and one primary speakers bureau that I'm very proud to be a part of is the National Marijuana Initiative that's co-funded with the HIDA program, and which is high intensity drug trafficking area. And so I have the opportunity to work with some world-class colleagues that are, profoundly educated on this issue, physicians and researchers and law enforcement officers. And some of them are just like, we're never going back. But to me, there are 2 questions in there. Why are states legalizing? But let's do the second question, since you asked that directly. Will we overturn this? I don't see that the way that we've done this is sustainable long term. I just don't see how it can be, because the campaigns for legalization basically say two things. We're going to regulate and control it so you won't have kids buying drugs off of a street corner from a drug dealer or in a back alley from a drug dealer. And so we'll have safe products in dispensaries. We've heard this argument before in several other renditions of legalizing vice type products. And of course, these things never turn out to be exactly what is promised. But so we said regulate and control, and then you're going to get tons and tons of money, and you're just all going to be rich. Billions of dollars coming into your state in tax revenues. For the smaller states, millions upon millions. Everybody's going to be rich. When Colorado was looking at legalization, I was speaking with one of our policymakers here, and he goes, what I don't understand is how legal marijuana is going to be a printing press of money. There's a finite number of dollars in the United States. And all it means is we're going to shift those dollars from school books, from textbooks, from buying your child's tennis shoes and school supplies and paying your rent to buying drugs. That's all this means. So we're just shifting dollars. So when we say billions of dollars in tax revenue or millions, for Colorado, initially, we brought in a lot of revenue because people were traveling here from other states and buying really, really high quality marijuana products. So we brought money into the state from all of our surrounding states. Well, one of our biggest customers were people from Oklahoma. Oklahoma has now far more liberal laws for adult use marijuana than we do. As does several surrounding states. So now the tourism is dying down. There's actually a documentary out there right now that Forbes magazine put out. A documentary is a loose word, but it's a YouTube video that's about an hour long. And there's growers in California complaining that we've destroyed their market by allowing other states to legalize, right? And then they say, they want federal legalization so they can start shipping their product across the country. But interstate commerce is probably never going to be allowed. So at the end of the day, the cash cow is dwindling. The price of marijuana is bottoming out. And also what we're finding is when you promise the voters that you're going to control and regulate a substance at the state government level, that's how we're going to do it, right? To keep a clean product. But then you simultaneously write a bill that allows everybody that lives in the state to grow the product in their own home. You completely undercut the tax, regulate, and control. So the taxes aren't what people had hoped because everybody grows their own. And then they've also found it's way cheaper to use the medical marijuana program because the taxation is very low on that. So in Colorado, if you have your medical marijuana card, your tax rate is like 3 to 5%. But if you go buy recreationally, your tax is like 25 to 30%. So who would buy that? Grow your own or get a medical card and escape all of that. So the taxes have plummeted. In Colorado, for all the reports that everyone has ever heard on the amazing amounts of money we're bringing into the state, our state has continually and perpetually been in budget crisis year over year. That has never stopped. All of the marijuana revenue money that we've brought into the state is less than 0.5% of our entire state budget. We've solved nothing. In fact, we've created more costly problems that we don't have money for. So this is why I say I don't think it's sustainable long term, because we're creating more problems than we're solving. Will it ever completely go away? I don't think it will ever completely go away. I think we're going to have to change things dramatically from the way that it's been done. Every time a new state brings a law to the table, I get phone calls of, can you come in and look at the plan that we've created? We're going to do it better than anybody else has ever done it before. We're really going to control it this time. We're really going to, make it the thing that it should have always been all along. But the one piece that they miss is capping the THC potency limits, and that's where we have the greatest problem. So nobody's figured that out. They don't want to listen to reason. And for all of the reasons that I already mentioned, states are legalizing because they think they're all going to be rich.
So,
I have yet to get my fat marijuana check in the mail.
well, let me ask this question. So two-part question. On the screen, do you think Congress will ever legalize marijuana entirely nationwide? And if so, what impact will that potentially have on employers' drug testing, drug-free workplace programs?
So I love this question, and I love having the opportunity to brainstorm about it. So there are elders in our industry, such as Bob DuPont, who I deeply respect and love, who says this can never happen because of the way that drug scheduling works. The DEA must investigate the scheduling of a drug and must determine through scientific study whether or not that drug can be rescheduled or descheduled, which would then de facto pave the way for legalization. President Obama requested that those studies be done, and the DEA came back. And by the way, it's not just the DEA that's involved in this. It's 6 different governmental agencies get involved. The FDA, the Department of Criminal Justice. I mean, there's all these different governmental agencies. The CDC gets involved. The National Institutes on Drug Abuse and Health. Everybody gets involved in this process, and the research is brought to bear, and it's been determined over and over and over again that by the defining definitions of why you schedule a drug, that cannabis fits the bill, and so we have to keep it scheduled. That having been said, we're in an era in our country where we're not following laws and rules, nor are we enforcing laws and rules. So can Congress just barrel in and legalize a drug that's still scheduled? The technical answer is absolutely not. They cannot do it, and that should never happen. However, they should not be allowing the states to do what they're doing because the drug is scheduled, et cetera. So even though I'm an optimist, I do have to say I've been shocked and shocked and shocked and shocked over these past 13 years by what we've done. So if it does happen, it would be another one of those shocking days. We blatantly disregarded every protocol and law that we have established to do this based on science. It would actually be done based on emotion and based on income. Make sure that we all understand revenue is driving all of these decisions. So if it happens, that on the other side, the next step is a lot of people are just terrified that that would be this massive free-for-all. Realize that if we do change the law and we do make it legal, now the FDA can step in and have some control over this thing. Right now, the FDA cannot really touch much of anything that has to do with cannabis because it's Schedule 1, so they're forbidden. And some people have told me that strong language, but prohibited, not allowed, whatever word you want to use, FDA can't touch cannabis and put warning labels on CBD, for example, because at the federal level, it's still Schedule 1. And so they cannot get involved in this. So if we change the scheduling or it becomes federally legal, now the FDA can step in and perhaps they could put caps on potency. Perhaps they could run, quote, medical marijuana through the pharmacy system and make sure you actually have a prescription instead of a fake piece of paper. So I think some interesting things could happen with federal legalization, but the thing that I worry about where that wouldn't happen is if the feds say it's legal, but it's up to the states to decide how to deal with it, we're not actually going to touch it. And then I think that would just continue to generate worse problems. So I don't have a crystal ball on it. I had heard if the if the Biden administration was elected in, the first thing that would happen was federal legalization. Well, that has not happened. And it's because there are these things in place that scientifically they haven't been able to get around. Doesn't mean that we disregard those.
That's also interesting that you do have, we're heading into a presidential election and you have candidates who are campaigning on this promise that they will legalize marijuana federally. And if that happens, what impact would it have, say, for example, on the DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations?
Well, one thing that NDASA has done is we have fought and continue to fight for safety carve-outs in these pieces of legislation that have moved forward. We have a lot of amazing partners on our side that we go to the mats and we tell them, you know, do you want your school bus drivers driving children high on out there, you know, on the school day? Your airline pilots, is this what you want? Some of them say we're fine with that as long as they're not high. It's really crazy. We're fine with it if they use marijuana as long as they're not high. But these statements come out of, listen, the cannabis lobby has deep pockets. They've thrown billions of dollars at legalization because this is a Wall Street enterprise. It's not a bunch of mom and pops or a bunch of old school hippie weed smokers. These are Wall Street companies now that are trying to push a huge commercial enterprise. So they're powerful. So that's why you hear policymakers say things like this and campaign on these things without actually knowing anything about it. Which they do on every other topic too.
Yeah.
So you know, at the end of the day, if it were to happen, what would it mean to DOT? What we continue to hear from policymakers is, well, no, but clearly, you know, they talk to us like we're stupid. Clearly, no one wants pilots high, so you're wrong. That will never happen. Well, the DOT laws are written to follow a chain of events, and the drugs that we test for have to be on the DEA list of Schedule I drugs or, you know, scheduled drugs. And so we might end up in a fight. We might end up in a fight on Capitol Hill to protect DOT, or maybe common sense would prevail before we got to that level. But that's why we go to DC. Our safety carve out is our banner that we fly high to protect DOT. And unfortunately, we've had to make some hard choices there. What happens to non-DOT, we would have to fight for every scrap that we could get, I think. And it's just tough, Bill. It just makes it really tough.
So let's pivot now to specific workplace questions then. The obvious one is, you know, what effects, if any, does marijuana use have on employees in the workplace? What should employers be concerned about, especially in light of the fact that, at least from the annual survey that we do every year at the Current Consulting Group, which we presented at the NDASA conference back in May in Bellevue, Washington, you have people in our industry, drug testing providers, who are saying we're having more and more clients tell us they don't want to test for marijuana. And so they're either not doing pre-employment screening that includes marijuana, or they're not testing post-accident or reasonable suspicion, or whatever the circumstances may be. The client has cut marijuana from their drug test panel, at least for pre-employment, if not for post-employment testing as well. Well, what are the consequences of that? What are the ways in which marijuana use affects the workplace, and what are employers missing if they're not testing for marijuana?
Bill, again, this is every question is so like we could probably spend a whole hour on each one of these. So you know how strongly I feel about that, but the short answer is, man, employers don't know what they don't know. They're being sold on this marketing campaign to legalize cannabis that it's no more harmless than a glass of wine. So if people can have a glass of wine at dinner, why can't they have their joint at night with dinner? They're fine when they come to work in the morning. But that is such a falsehood based on the cannabis that we have today. If we were talking about marijuana back in the 70s, that was very low grade, about 1 to 3%, you know what? I think you and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now, because it would probably be of little to no interest to us in the whole scheme of things. Maybe morally we'd have a problem with it, but ultimately we'd kind of have to reluctantly agree with that thinking. However, we haven't had potency that low grade in decades. When Colorado legalized in 2012, potency was between 12 and 15%. We saw the first cases of cannabis dependence disorder, which is addiction, back in the like 2005, 2009 era, when potency went over 5%. Once potency went over 5%, that's when people started having problems withdrawing and becoming, dependent on the substance. Well, once we legalized in Colorado and Washington State that year, 2012, the very next year, we saw potency go up to between 30 and 60% in concentrated forms. Now, what are concentrated forms? If you're listening to this webinar and you don't know what a marijuana concentrate is, Google it right now, and you will see products that are called dabs, wax, oil, honey oil, all different kinds of names. But these products are extremely potent, and they're put into edibles, they're vaped in vape pens. Now we're seeing elixirs and extracts that are 90 to 100%. So in the state of Colorado, we have marketing campaigns that say you can't find weed here for less than 30%. Now I don't think that's quite true. I think 25% is about as low as you can find in raw cannabis. But the issue being in that because we have such greater potency of products, first of all, we have higher highs, we have longer lasting highs. We have, so if you try to put this, like, if this is very new to you today and you're listening to this, I hate to make these comparisons, but it's kind of like if you have someone who's snorting cocaine versus smoking crack. That's something that drives home to us. We're like, or you know, meth versus, or you know, like they're smoking weed versus doing meth. We kind of villainize drugs on these different levels. So maybe if you say, you know, well, this person is drinking alcohol, but this person over here is doing heroin, that's really bad. That's what marijuana is like today. I've talked to people in the industry, in the cannabis industry, and I've said, I feel like it's a little unfair to classify concentrates, marijuana concentrates that are extracted through using butane and propane and high heat and pulling the oils out and changing their form. It's unfair to call that marijuana because we know marijuana is a plant. And that's why people say it's an herb, it's a plant, God gave it to us, versus this product over here that's been chemically created, and then we're just calling it all marijuana into laws, and employers don't understand this. So these are the products that are in vogue today. Everyone's got their vape pen. Well, when they get that vape pen out, you're talking always upwards of 30%. Usually you're right in that 60% THC realm. So now what you have is someone who can maintain their high all day, and they are impaired. Look, THC, any variety of THC, cannabis in any form, it's a drug. It's a psychoactive drug. It impairs. For any of us to think it does otherwise, it's a pretend world you're living in. It absolutely does impair. And people who use now can maintain their use all day through the glories of vaping or edibles. Now there's liquid form that you can drink. I mean, it's crazy out there. So what employers don't understand is when you have employees who are now operating at a baseline of being under the influence, the work productivity is impacted, safety is impacted, and what you're doing when you pull back your testing for THC is you are now willing to assume 100% of the liability and culpability and financial responsibility for what your employees are choosing to do. And so when you decide, I'm going to look the other way, I'm going to pretend this doesn't exist over here and pretend like it's harmless and go with the flow because I'm going to be the cool boss. That's the way I look at it. You're putting your employees' right to use drugs over the priority of safety of your other employees who choose not to, and your consumers and the public. When you do that, 100% of that liability is on you for anything that occurs. And your costs are going up across the board. Your productivity is going down. And so depending on the labor force that we're talking about, it affects some greater than others. Blue collar is typically affected greater. And there are some industries that are affected in a more significant way. And those are the industries that usually choose to test less. So it is going to cost, it is going to decrease safety and increase problems that you have in the workplace, people problems, productivity problems, etc. But these are things that employers are going to have to apparently learn the hard way. Those who those who see it, they see it for what it is and get it, and they put the boundary line down and don't allow it. But those who've chosen to play around with their policies and relax their practices, it costs, and in these difficult economic times, it's not a cost we can afford.
So that's a great response to a question I had coming up about, employers, for example, who say, if I test for marijuana, if I do pre-employment testing for marijuana, I can't find people to hire. And so as a result, they drop marijuana from their drug test panel and they hire more marijuana users, presumably, right? So that's one half of the equation. But in our annual survey at Current Consulting Group, we also asked, do you feel well prepared to respond to a client who tells you that they're thinking of dropping marijuana from their drug test panel? How would you respond to that? And my perception from the responses, because they were kind of all across the board, is that there are people in the industry who are in the business of helping employers put together safe workplace programs that include drug testing. What would you say to people in the industry who are, really expected to be consultants or experts on this subject when they're talking to their clients and instead admit that they're not really sure what to say?
I can understand why they're not sure what to say. I have spent over a decade researching this, and so it's all here on the tip of my tongue, but I understand that so many of us, that's not a world we walk in, and so we are kind of left dumbfounded to combat the huge media campaign that promotes cannabis. It's tough, I get it. And I just have to give a shout out. There's a woman in our industry named Andrea, and she lives in Michigan, and she just said, I am going to educate my community on this. And everybody can't do this, especially now, because my job has changed a little bit. But during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and even a bit last year, she set up weekly appointments with me and said, teach me everything you know. And she just asked me all these questions that you asked me. And she's like, people need to know this information. I think a lot of why we struggle to answer it is because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know about the high potencies. Employers don't know about the high potencies. Usually if we explain this to them, show them data, and this is why I'm on a speakers bureau, because I present on this topic a lot. Explain the higher potencies, explain the cost. There are actual loss of cost. Small business owners lose up to $7,000 a month in lost revenue based on their choice to not drug test. However, those are old numbers, and those are the most conservative numbers. There are studies out there that say 10,000, 12, and 15,000. I'm giving the most conservative estimate. If we talk to them about dollars that we're losing, I often like to talk to them about the safety aspect and that we care about people and we don't want people getting hurt. Unfortunately, tugging at the heartstrings doesn't always work when you're looking at a dollars and cents perspective. If you talk dollars and cents and the money that will be lost versus the money that will be saved, sometimes that gets through. But the other thing that I'll tell you is there's a perception out there I won't find any employees. And someone that's doing a fabulous job to help employers understand that the world isn't quite as skewed as they think is Chuck Marty in Denver. What he's been doing is telling employers, give it a try and see how many people test positive. And in the last couple of months, he often shares with me some of these experiments that he does with employers. He had a company call him a couple weeks ago and said, we found, I can't remember, it was either cocaine or meth in the break room. And they said, that's it. We're testing every employee in the company because we're going to find out who's using meth or cocaine. And they said, but we have a feeling if we test for marijuana, we'll, like all of our people are going to test for marijuana, or at least half, and we'll lose those people. So maybe don't test, don't test for marijuana, but we want everybody else tested for all the other drugs. And Chuck said, you know what, why don't you just see what happens? Let's test everybody and include the THC and see what happens. And at the end of the day, like out of 60 employees, it ended up like 2 or 3 people tested positive. And by the way, they didn't catch the drug they were looking for. So, here they have this perception, and he's done this over and over and over again with employers who say, oh my gosh, if we test for THC, that's it. We won't have anybody. And then they've come to find out that it really is kind of like that 5 to 10%, which is still the national statistic. So, and of course, you want to be careful with drug test cheating and all of that in there. But at the end of the day, it might not be as bad as they think. And for pre-employment testing, I do get that when you have people that are not in the workforce for a while, they take liberties. And so for pre-employment testing, this can be a problem for sure. But I always say we can't have it both ways. You can't tell them, well, we're not going to test you and we're not going to worry about it, but then we are, and you're going to lose your job. That creates a dichotomy, and it can erode company morality because it's a bait and switch. So I would have very honest adult conversations and say, we care about safety. We're not going to allow this. We realize you may have been indulging. If you test positive, do some policies like you can reapply in 30 days, or we're going to let you start, but in 30 days, you're going to be subject to random testing pool or whatever. There's things that we can do here that are common sense approaches, rather than just having this black and white, all or nothing, forget pre-employment testing altogether because it doesn't work. It's a bad policy to have, especially if you need to protect safety.
Okay, so let me tell the audience that we're way off on these questions on the slides. So I knew this would happen, but that's good. We're getting some great information. So what I'm going to do is advance the slides because we've gone through a lot of these questions already. And I want to go to this slide that has Joe's contact information on it. We still have a few minutes to go, but let's go into what, Joe, let's go into the lightning round, okay? Fast questions, fast answers, because I want to get a bunch more in if possible. What do you say to those people who, there's a school of thought in our industry that, and of course we know that a drug test legally, scientifically doesn't prove that somebody's impaired, but we have people out there who are saying employers have really no right to know if their workers have marijuana in their system while they're at work. There was a study out of the University of Sydney that said the average window of impairment is 3 to 10 hours from THC, depending on lots of factors, including, the potency, the THC potency level that you talked about. So what do you say to those who say that we shouldn't be concerned about impairment because it's really none of our business if somebody's been using marijuana?
We've proven through, again, decades of case law that there's a social contract between an employee and an employer. And even the employee and their community, that they will agree to work in a safe manner to not cause harm to themselves or others. And the employer has a social contract with their community for responsible hiring practices and to also protect the safety and well-being of the community. So not caring or thinking that it's none of their business, that goes against what their responsibility is to, again, protect. We saw in Drug-Free Workplace Act, even though it's not highly enforced, Drug-Free Workplace Act found in Congress and made federal law that every employer has a responsibility to protect the vulnerable and to protect the employee who chooses not to use drugs from the harms of those that do. So it is their responsibility to care. And someone operating under the influence or impaired by any substance is every employer's responsibility to make sure they can get them out of a place where they can harm others and into a place where they're either operating safely or no longer in that realm of impacting safety. And I get that not every job that a person can have is labeled safety sensitive, but I always challenge employers, tell me the position that you have in your company where someone operating under the influence cannot cause any harm. And I had someone say, well, it's our accountant. Okay, well, there's such a thing as security sensitive, and you pretty much don't want your people dealing with your finances. Tell a banker that and they'll croak. It doesn't work that way. So at the end of the day, Bill, impairment matters, and there are other ways in which we can determine impairment that are not a drug test. So I like to say under the influence matters, and it matters huge. You have a responsibility to make sure that's not taking place.
So there's been a little bit of emphasis in the industry recently, and it's taken the industry a long time to get to this point, that a drug testing method that can prove recent use is more valuable than other drug testing methods. I'm not saying yes or no to that, but there was a report that was put out by a very popular trucking association. I won't say their name, but it just came out this week, essentially saying that urine testing was not worth the trouble because you miss so many positives that you would get with, say, hair testing with its longer window of detection. And yet you have other people on the other saying you only need a 2 to 3 hour window of detection, and that's all you really have the right to know. And then recently, as people in the industry know, back in May, the U.S. Department of Transportation put out final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing, which after certain conditions are met sometime in the hopefully near future, employers who are covered under the DOT regs will have the option between urine and oral fluid testing. But it almost feels, Joe, like within our industry, we're sort of pitting one against the other. We're playing mom against dad a little bit on drug testing methods. What do you think, what would you say to people in our industry who are sort of feel a compulsion to pick sides, I guess?
So Bill, I'm going to go with my gut on this answer. I have a lot of answers to this question, but there's something that's just hitting me really hard, and I feel like I need to put it in these terms too, because you're right, pitting mom against dad, and people are fighting for their own interests in here for a variety of reasons, and for reasons that matter to them. So they find things to make their argument regardless. Let's set that all aside and let's just say this. If someone, the number one time of day for years that the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NHTSA, catches people driving under the influence of alcohol is 8 a.m. to noon. And the reason that's the number one time of day for DUI is because people drink more than they should. They don't understand their body elimination rates. They drink into the night, even midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. Then they go to bed and they think, I wake up, I'm good to go to work, or I got to work safely, now I'm good to go to lunch, and they're still operating under the influence of alcohol. Did they use it at work? No, they did not. Is it a recent use test that says they just used in the last 3 hours since they got to work? No, it is not. It's what is left in your bloodstream that is impacting you right now. Go to lunch, get a DUI, have been working under the influence all morning. Cannabis is similar in that regard, but different in many others, in that we do not know. One of the reasons it's Schedule 1, we do not know what impacts a person's metabolization of cannabis. They're now saying that some of this may just be genetics and we'll never really fully understand. Some people are under the influence when they used at home. Some people are managing to use at work, and now we care about those people too. But for those people who are using concentrates or edibles on their property, if they come to work and are operating under the influence during work hours, you better believe you care about it. And so I'm excited about a recent use test for that reason. And it is not an impairment test. We don't have a drug test that's an impairment test. There are other types of cognitive things that we're going to have to use to determine impairment, but it does matter. And if we can clear out that noise of, I want hair, I want oral fluid, I want urine, urine's bad, everything else is bad, whatever. And let's just look at alcohol. We make very clear and decisive determinations based on alcohol and how one behaves and their potential to behave. We need to do the same thing with cannabis and stop this messing around with all the political issues and financial issues that have to do with cannabis.
Okay, so we're almost at the top of the hour. Excuse me. And let me just ask Jessica first, because some people will have to jump off the call at the hour mark. But and what's your schedule, Joe? Can you take a couple of questions from the audience?
I sure can.
Okay, so Jessica, I have a question for Joe that wasn't on our schedule, but tell me if we've got some questions you'd like to ask from the Q&A section.
No, you can go ahead. I do have some questions, but we can answer those offline and we can continue with yours. We will send out the recording and an email to those who've joined us today, and we'll send out answers to the questions that have been submitted there as well. So if you'd like to go ahead, they'll get the answers either way.
Okay, so maybe we can close with this question then, and then maybe do another webinar. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask you in light of, you know, things that are going on in sort of state legislation, the federal regulations, I already alluded to DOT and oral fluid testing. The state of Washington sort of recently followed the example of California and passed a law that would would prohibit employers from testing for cannabis with a testing method that only reveals the presence of a metabolite. They call it the non-psychoactive metabolite of cannabis versus the parent drug. And of course, oral fluid detects the parent drug. But are we going to see more legislation like that? Is this sort of part of the attack on drug testing that the legalization folks feel is so important to their movement?
Absolutely, 100% across the board. And I can say that with certainty because Normal, that I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, created two daughter or sister associations, however you look at it. One is called the Drug Policy Alliance, and the other is called the National or the Marijuana Policy Project, MPP. Marijuana Policy Project has largely been a marketing arm, I guess, if you will, and Drug Policy Alliance has been the policy side that has their think tank. They hire young attorneys out of college. They've written the laws that have impacted our states. They brought them to each state. There's been no citizens movement that have said, oh my gosh, we just have to legalize marijuana. It's been the Drug Policy Alliance, and it's been a very coordinated effort. Back a decade ago, the leader of Drug Policy Alliance is a man named Ethan Nadelman. You can look him up. Ethan Nadelman did a lot of publicity out there for legalization of drugs, and been huge in the media, debating on all the talk shows and whatnot. He's a major mouthpiece for legalization over the last 15 to 20 years, not so much maybe in the last 2 or 3 years. But Ethan Nadelman has tons of videos out there that said, why are we legalizing all drugs? Because we love drugs, and we have to start by gaining sympathy and getting people to like us. So we can't let you 21-year-olds and under use them now, but eventually we'll lower the age to 18, and then we'll remove the age restrictions. And we got to start with marijuana because people will really like it because it's medical marijuana, but we will get all drugs legalized. That is the goal. No bones about it. I mean, they were very forthright with their goals. And so initially when we started legalizing marijuana, and some of us in the prevention world would say, this is just the first tipping point to legalizing all drugs. A lot of people go, come on, you sound a little crazy. And, Joe's got her tinfoil hat on. When my governor in the state of Colorado was elected a few years ago, he was the strongest legal cannabis proponent. He came to us from California. He signed, authored every pro-cannabis piece of legislation that went through Colorado since he got into our Senate. The very first act that he did as governor was legalize personal use amounts of all drugs. A lot of people don't know that personal use of all drugs in the state of Colorado has been legal now for 6 years. They just don't realize it because we've not made it massively public, but there's no penalties or fines, even for fentanyl. Can't stress that enough. So the reason Oregon is different was because it got a lot of media attention and it's become very publicized. But the goal is legalize all drugs. So people go, well, mushrooms being legalized is okay because that's medicine, and there's a study out there that says it could be medicine. And then, cocaine used to be a medicine, and if you think I'm sounding ridiculous, guys, this is going to be the argument. It's going to be the same argument that we've heard from all of the other ones. We're first going to have to lift that drug up as a paragon of it has some benefit, and then we'll play the thing of, well, it helps this veteran, or it helps this older person, or it helps this child, and then we're going to allow it and tolerate it. And then we have this other issue coming in that is safe use of drugs. So for those who want to use, we'll do heroin injection rooms, and we'll do in Colorado, it's medically assisted mushroom use, like, psychoactives or whatever. And we're going down this path that has been proven to fail in Europe and in some other countries. But it really is licensed by those, again, who want to profit from addiction. That's all they want. They want to profit from addiction. and they're making monies off the backs of the burdens of others in the same exact way that the Sackler family did with pharmaceuticals. And if you watch those stories and you hate those stories, but you're being party to this, then you're no different. And we have to remember that.
Well, let me just say this in closing. One of our good mutual friends in the industry, Dean Classy, just posted on LinkedIn a story about the 1987 Amtrak Conrail train crash that really sort of gave national attention to the problem of drugs in the workplace, as if there wasn't enough already evidence of that. But I thought it was interesting that the recent controversy with cocaine being found in the White House is now being blamed on workers who are there doing work on the Situation Room. And that would make it probably the most high-profile drugs in the workplace incident in 30 years. So we'll see how that evolves. But Joe, thank you very much for all the great information that you just shared with us. You're a wealth of knowledge, a great treasure in our industry, and we appreciate very much that you've taken the time to do this presentation.
Thank you for having me, Bill. I really appreciate it.
All right, Jessica, we're good.
All right. Thank you both for your time and going through those questions. Thank you to our attendees for being with us today. Thank you to NDASA for sponsoring today's webinar presentation. If you're not yet a member of NDASA, this is my plug to go join. We appreciate our opportunity to work with the industry through NDASA. And so with that, we'll conclude today's webinar presentation. As I mentioned before, today's presentation has been recorded and you will receive information on how to access that recording. Additionally, the questions that were submitted that were not answered live today, we will send out a little Q&A email with the link to the recording so that you can see what those answers are, which also will include some of the links to the information that was presented today, some of those studies and whatnot, so you can review that information. We want you outfitted and ready to go out and share this information with your colleagues and with your clients so that we can keep circulating the right message. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much and have a great day.